Courage is not born in comfort. It's born in friction. It's born when you have to align integrity and vulnerability to make tough decisions in your life. Hi, welcome back to Reflect Forward. I'm your host, Kerry Siggins, and I'm so glad you are here today. So recently, I had to give feedback to a person, and I really did not want to give this feedback. I had all kinds of reasons that I didn't want to give it, but mostly I was afraid of how it was going to be received and that this person might lose respect for me for sharing something that I was seeing and how I really felt. And I built up all these stories in my head about why I didn't want to give the feedback. And when I sat down to do it, I had those nerves. I had that pit in my stomach. I had the fight and flight hormones racing through me. And I had to remind myself that it takes courage to give someone tough feedback. And you can do it in a kind way, you can do it in a helpful way, but it still takes courage. And I had to remind myself of this mantra that courage isn't loud, courage is quiet, vulnerable, and rooted in integrity. You got to do the right thing. It doesn't have to be this big blow up, this big hard thing. You just have to say what needs to be said, even if it means being a little bit vulnerable, like sharing how you really feel about something, share how it's not going well for you, and rooted in integrity of like, this person deserves this feedback. And that's what this podcast is today. It's around this core idea that courage equals vulnerability plus integrity. And this is the formula that has really guided my leadership. Always do the right thing. Always be courageous. And that takes vulnerability. So we're going to talk about that today. And I'm going to share some personal stories of how this equation has really helped me become a better leader and transform how I've lived, and hopefully will inspire you to transform how you live as well. Because let's face it, we leaders face immense pressure. We need to do everything right. We need to be decisive. We need to be confident. We need to just march ahead and show that nothing bothers us. And that just simply isn't true, because real leadership is not about control. It's not about always being perfect. It's not about doing the right thing all the time. No, it's about building connections with others. And those connections start with vulnerability. And why does this matter right now? Because the world is in desperate need of courageous leaders, leaders who are willing to say, ugh, this feels icky, but I'm going to do it because it is the right thing. And that is how you build respect. That is how you build connection with people. That is how you build great cultures, by doing the right thing, by leading with vulnerability, by being courageous. So let's start with redefining courage, because I think that we think of courage as heroism. And really, to me, it's about humility. So let's unpack the myth of courage. Traditional courage is seen as bold, fearless acts on the battlefield or in crises. I can take bold action. She's so courageous because she's taking action and just leading in this bold way. And with leadership courage, I think that people view that as quiet, often unseen acts, like telling the truth or doing the right thing or risking emotional exposure. And those things are absolutely true. But I'd like to shift the lens, because what I've learned is that courage is not about being fearless. It's about acting from your values, even when fear is present. It's about letting people see you, not just this polished version of yourself, but the human behind the role. The way that I look at leadership is that titles are just a bunch of letters behind my name. I'm just a human being trying to play the role that I have to play in this company, which happens to be a CEO, the best I possibly can. It doesn't make me better than anybody else. It doesn't make me any less human than anybody else, any less vulnerable, any less fearful of making mistakes and worrying about what people think and all of those things that being a human is. Because we leaders, let's face it, we are just humans. I'd like to share a story about a time when I had to be very courageous, and it was one of the hardest things that I've done. So several years ago, we decided that we were going to make a major business model shift, selling direct to our customers in the US first and then eventually in Europe, instead of through distributors. And this was a significant shift for us because we relied on our long-standing relationships with our distributors to sell our products. But we were making new products, more complicated, automated solutions, and we need to have the direct relationships with our customers. But making a big decision like this, it takes a lot of courage. I didn't know if I was making the right decision. We were doing things that we had never done before as a company, but I knew in my heart that it was the right thing. Even though I was scared, and even though a lot of people within the company did not believe that it was the right decision, and even though I made a lot of people mad when I made this decision, I still made it because I knew it was the right decision. And I was willing to risk being judged or rejected, misunderstood, even risk making mistakes, making the wrong decision, because I knew it was the right thing in my heart. I needed to act with integrity. I needed to be in alignment with my values of innovation, of disruption, of driving the industry forward, and of creating value for our customers and our employees by developing products and eventually services that were going to make it easier for our customers to go home safely to their families every single night, and easier to grow this company to really bring true value to our employee owners, being an employee-owned company. And the result of that was courage. The vulnerability of making a wrong decision, of having people disagree with me. I had an employee, a trusted person, leave the company because he felt so strongly that I was making the wrong decision. That was really hard. But I acted with integrity, knowing that it was the right decision for us in the future, even if it meant some very difficult decisions, very difficult conversations in that moment. That's why I love this equation of courage equals vulnerability plus integrity. And I think this Brené Brown quote sums it up so beautifully. She says, vulnerability is not winning or losing, it's having the courage to show up when you can't control the outcome. Oh my God, that is literally how I felt in that situation. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about saying, this is how we need to go to business to create real value for our customers and our employee owners, even if I don't know what that outcome is going to be. So now let's unpack vulnerability and integrity a little bit, and then we'll get into why this equals courage. I believe that vulnerability is a absolute leadership strength, a superpower, like we talked about in a podcast a couple of weeks ago. I do not believe the myth that vulnerability is a weakness. Yes, it's an emotional risk, but it is one that is required to build trust and connection. People do not relate to a perfect leader who is always fearless and always bold and never makes mistakes and is never scared. No, that is not a real human being. We are all scared at times. And when we tell people like, oh, I believe this is the right thing, but it's going to be hard, and I'm not 100% sure what the outcome is going to be, people can connect with that because they feel those same things too. The truth is that leaders who are vulnerable create psychological safety, because others can see themselves in that leader. If that leader can say, yeah, I made a mistake, or I'm not 100% sure how this is going to turn out, but I know in my heart this is the right thing for us to do, it absolutely allows people to connect with you in that deeper humanity. And when people are connecting with their leaders on that human level, it fuels innovation. It fuels resilience. It makes people feel like we're all in this together, because the reality is that we are. We're not leaders and employees. We are one team that's working together to move the company forward, to create an amazing culture where people love to work. It takes every single one of us. And we can't do that if we are not connecting with each other. And that requires vulnerability. So this really happened in COVID, and I've shared this story before, but that was one of the most vulnerable times I've ever had as a leader, because I had no idea what was going to happen, along with every other leader in the world. We had no choice but to be vulnerable. It is not easy to get up in front of your employees and say, I don't know how long this is going to last. I don't know what the impact is going to be. But I do know that we're going to make it through this, and we're going to make it through together. But it doesn't mean that we're not going to have hard decisions to make. And we made some very difficult decisions. And yes, 2020 hurt, but we came out of it so much stronger. And I believe that was a defining moment in not only in my leadership, but leadership throughout the entire company, because we had to be vulnerable. There was no choice. We had to have really hard conversations with our employees after we had to make really tough decisions. And I would go home and I would cry sometimes, wondering, can I make it through this? Do I have what it takes to lead through this? And the answer was absolutely yes. But it is going to take vulnerability to make it through it. To go back to Brené Brown, because I am a huge Brené Brown fan. If you don't know Brené Brown, you should. She is a research professor at the University of Houston, and she spent 20 plus years studying vulnerability, courage, shame, and empathy. She has so many books. My favorite one is Dare to Lead. We've read it as an executive management team. It is amazing. And her research shows that vulnerable leaders foster greater innovation, connection, and trust. And that is what we need as leaders to build strong teams and strong companies. And in her book, Dare to Lead, she writes, "You can't get to courage without walking through vulnerability." And that is so true. So how can you practice vulnerability? So here are a few of the things I do. Be open about yourself. Share some of yourself. I share my story of overcoming substance abuse issues, and that took a lot of vulnerability. It was very scary when I told my team because I thought they would reject me. Why would I want to work for somebody who had a drug problem is what I thought that they would think. But it was absolutely the right thing to do. We were trying to foster this greater connection within the team, and it opened up so much more vulnerability between other team members when I was open. You should be open about uncertainty when appropriate, like talking to my employees during COVID, saying, I'm not sure how this is going to turn out, but we're going to do everything that we can to get through it together, even though we are going to have to make some painful decisions. I did the same thing when we were hacked. I had no idea what was going to happen when I brought all my employees in for an all hands meeting on the Monday morning after to tell them, hey, we got hacked. And there's a lot of unknowns right now. But two things are going to happen. One, our customers aren't going to feel a thing, and we're going to do everything we can to not have to pay the hackers. It is so scary to tell your employees, I don't know what the outcome is going to be. There is some uncertainty here. I'm doing it right now with all of the tariffs. I drafted an email to my employees saying, look, these are the tariffs that are happening. We are absolutely expecting it to impact us, and it could be negative, and here's what we're going to do. But with so much uncertainty, I cannot tell you that this is how it's going to look. I think we should just be prepared for it to be a bumpy year. That is an appropriate thing to do, and that is how you practice vulnerability. Another way to practice vulnerability is to share the learning process, not just your wins. I share all the times I screw up. Just recently, I shared on this podcast about rolling out strategic planning videos to all of our employees. We make sure everybody understands the strategy. We have this whole process. I think it works really well. But in my effort to be succinct and to not have these videos drag on for hours and hours, I summarized, I synthesized, I gave a high-level overview. And in one particular area of our strategy, it wasn't enough. And it caused all kinds of questions, and it caused people to be upset. And that stung. And so at the next company meeting, I said, hey, I want to do a deeper dive in this. And I really appreciate your feedback. And I learned from this. I learned that when we're talking about some things that are major shifts in our business, that it requires a deeper dive. It requires me to give more details so that you all don't have to tell yourself a story about what's going on. And I own that. That's sharing my learning process, not just a win. That wasn't a win. 100% it's the right strategy. 100% it's what we're doing. But I didn't do it right. And so I shared that with my team. And finally, another way to practice vulnerability is to invite feedback. I asked for feedback and I got it, and I really listened to it. And yes, that creates all kinds of vulnerability. I would be lying if I said that getting that feedback didn't sting. It did sting a little bit. I put a lot of effort into those videos with the goal of it landing well with everybody. And when I found out it didn't, I was like, oh, dang it. But I so appreciated the feedback because it made the plan better. It allowed me to do a deeper dive to help people really feel more connected and to understand. And not everybody was going to agree, and that's okay. But the feedback allowed me to show people that I was listening and to help bring them along and to admit that I could have done something better. That is powerful. So as you're thinking about being a more vulnerable leader, ask yourself, where in my leadership am I hiding behind strength? And what would it look like to show up just 5% more vulnerable? You don't have to share your deepest, darkest secrets. I totally get that that might be taking it too far for you. It worked for me because of who I am. I am such an open book person. You know that by listening to this podcast, that telling my story was very authentic and it was the right thing to do in the moment. You don't have to do that, but you can show up just 5% more vulnerable, and it will allow people to connect with you deeper, and it allows you to practice, and it allows you to see that being vulnerable isn't such a scary thing, that people actually appreciate it, connect with you more on it, and respect you more as a leader for it. All right, so now let's dive into integrity and why it is the backbone of courage. To me, integrity is about living in alignment. It's about acting in alignment with your values, even when it costs you. Integrity is not about being perfect. It's about being consistent. And integrity is about always doing the right thing, or at least what you think is the right thing in that moment. It might be a bad decision, but if you are in alignment with your values and saying, I believe that this is the right thing to do, then you are acting with integrity. I am a huge believer in doing the right thing. My team knows that. Let's always do the right thing. Always do the right thing. Always do the right thing. They've heard that from me hundreds, if not thousands of times. And a few years back, we made a decision to cut a corner to speed something up. It was around a certification process, and a team decided that we're probably not going to ever get caught if we don't do this certification. So let's go ahead and move forward because it could slow down the process by a couple of months, and we don't have a couple of months. And so that was the decision that was made. And it came back to bite us. And as we were doing an after action review, I asked the question, how was this decision made? Why was this decision made? We did a deeper dive into it, and I learned that the team felt the pressure to hit a deadline and decided to cut a corner. And it was such a great learning opportunity. No one got in trouble. We went back and we did the certification. Yes, it slowed down the process a little bit, but it was the right thing to do. We always do the right thing. And so what I told my team is this: look, I understand that we have deadlines and that there's pressure to perform, there's pressure to get things done, there's pressure to get new products out to the market, but we can never cut corners and not do the right thing as a company. And so I want you all to know that if you feel that pressure, you can bring that decision to me, because I know that I will always do the right thing as a company. And yes, I get it that because I'm the CEO of the company, it's easy for me to make that decision. I can make the trade-off. I want you to feel like you can make that trade-off too and say, no, we are going to do the right thing. But if you feel that pressure, don't succumb to it. Bring it to me and I will make that decision. And then that way you don't have to have the burden of saying, do I not act with integrity here because I'm trying to achieve this goal? That is such a slippery slope. Integrity absolutely matters. Your team is watching your behavior more than they are listening to your words. So if you say one thing and you do another, then you are not acting with integrity. And integrity builds credibility over time. It is an absolute non-negotiable for trust, and you want to have trust on your team. So show up with integrity. Are you always doing the right thing? Are you doing what you say you're going to do? Are you acting in alignment with the values of your company and your personal values? How do you go about understanding what integrity is to you? So where do you get started with this? First, identify your top 3 values. What is most important to you? And then ask yourself, am I living in alignment with these values? Where am I compromising for convenience or for comfort or for approval? That is not acting with integrity. And that is where you have to start, with your own personal values. And I'd like to share this insight with you because I think this is so important. Because without integrity, vulnerability feels manipulative. It does. People can say, this person is just trying to manipulate my emotions by sharing this story. When your vulnerability is aligned with integrity, it becomes courageous. And that is really powerful. So let me give you a real world example besides just my stories. So let's talk about Howard Schultz. He is the former CEO of Starbucks. Howard grew up in public housing. He was very, very poor. And he often shared his story to humanize his leadership. He wanted people to know that he just always wasn't this successful, wealthy person, that he really grew up with a tough life. And how this showed up for him was wanting to address issues like race and inequality. And that can be a really vulnerable place as a CEO, especially today. It's so taboo to talk about race and DEI and inequality right now. But the reality is that those things absolutely exist. And he was a leader in discussing those types of social issues, understanding that it might be risky for him to do so. But because of his experience of growing up so poor in public housing, it was something that he was very passionate about and felt very connected to, and that he could make an impact by using his platform to make a difference. And how he acted with integrity is that when there were economic downturns, he knew that it would affect his most vulnerable employees, those people who were showing up part-time to Starbucks coffee houses. they're not making a lot of money. And if he cut benefits or cut pay, he knew how much that would impact him. And because he grew up in public housing and he knew what it was like to struggle, he was determined to not have to make those choices. And so he acted with alignment to his values, and he refused to cut employee benefits when there was economic downturns. And he stood by his values despite the financial risk. That takes courage. Vulnerability, integrity equals courage. And why does he exemplify this formula? He acted from his heart and his values, not from fear of backlash. And he chose to be seen, to speak out, and to lead through the discomfort because he knew it was the right thing. Howard Schultz showed us that courage isn't about grand gestures. It's about taking a principled stand, even when it's easier not to. That is courage. All right, so now let's dive into how you build courage, because I will tell you, it is uncomfortable, and you've got to get comfortable being uncomfortable if you want to be a courageous leader. And remember, this is not supposed to be easy. Courage is not born in comfort. It's born in friction. It's born when you have to align integrity and vulnerability to make tough decisions in your life. So how do you build this habit? Start with micro bravery moments. Share one small truth about yourself per day. Doesn't have to be a big one, doesn't have to be a big secret. Just practice those micro moments of bravery and vulnerability by sharing one small truth a day, one mistake that you made. Hey, I don't really know how to do this well. I made this mistake. I need help with this. It builds courage over time. That is how you build the courage habit. Pause before reacting and ask yourself the question, what would courage look like right now? When we don't pause before reacting, we can show up in a less authentic way. We might want to protect and defend. We might want to deflect. We might want to minimize what's going on. But when you pause, you can ask yourself the question, what would courage look like right now? And remember, courage is vulnerability plus integrity. And when you pause to ask yourself, how am I going to be courageous right now? It allows you to not just react, but respond in that courageous way. And then finally, journal. Gosh, you know how much I love journaling. I'm just such a huge believer in it. As you're building this courage habit, ask yourself for a couple of weeks every day, where did I lead with courage? Where did I hide? And analyze that. Put it into ChatGPT and have ChatGPT tell you what it thinks. It's amazing what insight you will gain. Remember, vulnerability is the birthplace of innovation, creativity, and change, per Brené Brown. And I think that's a really important thing to remember as leaders. So as you're thinking about building your courage habit, ask yourself this today. What's one thing you're afraid to say but need to say? What's one truth you've been avoiding but need to own? Be honest with yourself. Answer these questions and then act with vulnerability and integrity so that you can show up courageously. That is this podcast episode for today. I hope that it inspired you to embrace this formula of courage equals vulnerability plus integrity, because when you lead from both, you can build a team, a culture, a company, and a life, most importantly, that's deeply respected, deeply meaningful, and profoundly impactful. I know firsthand, as I have practiced being a courageous leader, and I will tell you, it has not always been easy, and I have made some major mistakes in this journey. I can tell you that I have such a rich life because I live by this equation. So my call to action to you is this week, be 5% more honest, be 5% more human, be 5% more courageous. All right, with that, I will wrap up this episode. Thank you so much for joining me. And if you like this episode and you feel that it is worth sharing, please do so. And if you like this podcast, please go on to YouTube and subscribe to it. Go on to your favorite podcast platform, subscribe to it, write a review, leave me a comment. It helps the algorithms. It shows that this podcast is helpful and useful to people. And that helps with rankings. And I really appreciate it as I'm building this podcast, hopefully to help all of you find that inspiration within yourself to unleash your full leadership potential. Thanks. Take care. We'll see you next week.